Good evening and welcome. My name is Moritz Riede and I would like to welcome you here and online on behalf of Wolfson College and Wolfson College Earth Emergency Research Cluster. Those who had a chance to walk around college before the talk may have seen that it's currently a construction site. This is the college's efforts to do their part, and we're carrying out major works to reduce the carbon footprint of our main estate by more than 80% by next summer. And the role of the Earth Emergency Research Cluster is partially to support Wolfson's journey towards sustainability and to offer a forum like this one for interesting debates around the whole topic that we're facing with the climate emergency or Earth emergency more generally. So we are extremely delighted to kick off Michaelmas term with a talk by George Monbiot. Many of you may know Mr. Monbiot, but those who don't, he's a writer and political activist and a long-term defender of nature and society. He has researched in and reported from Latin America, Africa, and various other parts of the world on people fighting for their land and their environment. He's actively involved himself in fighting for the protection of the environment, and he's not afraid to get arrested in doing so. He has an extremely busy schedule, and we're really delighted to welcome him here tonight in Wolfson College, and I'm not sure whether it had anything to do with his fondness of wolves that he accepted our invitation. And his talk tonight will be about Survival Requires Disobedience. So please welcome Mr. George Monbiot.
Thank you very much, Moritz. Thank you for coming, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in online. Now, one of the tragedies of our existence is that our survival, in fact, everything about our lives, depends on systems which are too complex to comprehend. In fact, even the tool we use to try to comprehend them, the human brain, is itself too complex to comprehend. And by complex systems, I don't mean merely complicated ones, like, for instance, a car engine, which I don't understand either, but is a complicated thing made by people which performs as a merely complicated system does. In other words, it responds to pressure, like your foot on the accelerator, in a linear and incremental way. It's predictable, and you know what its tolerances are, and you know that if you overstretch it, certain things are likely to happen, but if you stay within those tolerances, you can be pretty sure that those things aren't going to happen until it breaks down, whereupon it needs to be mended. That's a complicated system, which is actually a really simple thing to get your head around by contrast to a complex system. And a complex system is a completely different thing. A complex system, for instance, like the human brain, or like the atmosphere, or like the global circulation system, or like the soil, or like the global financial system, or the global academic system for that matter, has self-organizing properties. You can't predict how it's going to behave just by looking at its components in isolation, because they self-organize. And as a result, it has emergent and adaptive characteristics caused by the interaction between those components, which form a sort of spontaneous network. You could look at this, if you were an alien life form coming to this planet, never having encountered a complex system before, you would assume it was a form of intelligent life. We don't think that most complex systems are, but you never know. But they have these weird characteristics which seem quite spooky when you first begin to encounter them and get a sort of small measure of understanding of them. And one of the outcomes of this self-organization is that complex systems maintain an equilibrium state within certain external parameters. So within a certain range of stress applied to those systems, they will effectively absorb that stress and through their self-organizational properties maintain stability, maintain more or less an equilibrium state. But if you push them further and further, if you apply more and more stress, they will, for a while, maintain that state. And then they will suddenly reach a tipping point and flip over into a completely different equilibrium state, which they will immediately also, through their self-organizing properties, begin to stabilize in that new equilibrium state. They have tipping points, critical thresholds, beyond which everything changes. And a further characteristic of complex systems, common to all those that have been studied, is that once they have flipped, once they've passed that tipping point, they're subject to what is called hysteresis. And what this means in a nutshell is that the energy required to push them past that tipping point is far smaller than the energy required to push them back the other way. So it's like a boulder perched on top of a hill, chocked in place with a few small pebbles. It doesn't take a lot to take those pebbles out, but once you have, that boulder rolls to the bottom of the hill, and getting it back up again might be impossible. The global banking system very nearly collapsed, very nearly passed its tipping point in 2008, and it was pushed to that point, very close to that point, really by what seemed to be comparatively minor factors, such as a subprime crisis in the United States. In terms of the amount of money involved, it wasn't huge. But even though it didn't pass the tipping point, in order to stabilize it and get it back into the safe space, trillions of dollars had to be poured in. Far more energy, in this case money, had to be used to stabilize that system and keep it within its equilibrium state than would have been needed to tip it over into a state of total collapse, and we came very close indeed. Similarly with the soil. Soil is a fantastic, amazing system whose basic properties we've scarcely begun to understand. In fact, just 2 years ago, scientists published a paper in which they said, we think we know what soil is now. It's quite amazing, because everything depends. 99% of our calories come from the soil, directly or indirectly. And it's astonishing how little we know about it, and how, in a way, how sort of uninterested we've been in discovering how it functions and how it works. But it turns out to be a phenomenally complex series of interactions between the sort of physical properties, the minerals and the long-chain organic molecules, and the bacteria, the fungi, the other microbes, the plants, the microorganisms, the slightly larger organisms within it, all of which create this amazing fractally scaled and stable structure. And it's because it's a complex system that within the normal range of weather, it stays on the land. And if soil is what people once thought it was, which was just basically a load of minerals and organic molecules just dumped together on the land, if you had fairly severe weather, like a drought followed by high winds or a drought followed by floods, the whole lot would just slide straight off the land. That's what happens if you dump a load of sand mixed with a load of other stuff into a pile. It'll just wash away. But within the range of normally severe weather, it stays on the land. What happened at the beginning of the 20th century in the US, particularly in the southern Great Plains, was a series of assaults on the soil through repeated ploughing, which turned out to be completely inappropriate for the soil type, followed by severe drought, and that led to the Dust Bowl. And even in 1937, in a federal government report, there was a pithy comment which showed that they understood the principle of hysteresis. The report said, one man can cause this, but one man can't undo it. They understood that basic principle that once it's past the tipping point, it's much, much harder to do anything about it. Now, there's a couple of other common characteristics of complex systems which have been discovered fairly recently. One very interesting paper shows that you can go in blindfold. You don't need to know what complex system you are looking at, whether it's a shipping insurance network or an Antarctic ice shelf or an ocean circulatory system. You don't need to be told what it is. By looking at the mathematical values of its components, you can determine whether that is resilient or fragile, whether it might be in a good state or might be in a vulnerable state, which is slightly scary when you think about it. That, you know, there are certain mathematical values to do with the nodes, which is the sort of blobs within the system, like the banks in the banking system, how big they are, how well connected they are with each other, how many connections go through particular large nodes, these sorts of values which can tell you whether you're looking at a system which is fundamentally resilient or fundamentally fragile. But there's another characteristic which I think is possibly even more pertinent to this discussion. And this is that when a complex system, regardless of what it is, begins to approach a tipping point, its outputs start to flicker. And the closer to the tipping point you come, the wilder the fluctuations are. Now, if we look at the weather events of the past year, heat domes over the Pacific region of North America, the massive fires there and droughts, fires in Siberia, around the Mediterranean, the huge floods in China, in West Africa, in Northern Europe. This, to me, looks very much like flickering. This looks like a series of systems, because we're talking about interlocking complex systems here, atmosphere, circulatory system, biosphere, soils, ocean systems. These interlocking complex systems look to me as if they, or some of their components, are getting pretty close to a tipping point. And if they flip, if they tip, realistically there's no way of tipping them back. We also know that because our Earth systems don't remain within their boxes that we've created just to study them, you know, we'll say, oh, this is the climate, this is the ecosystem, this is the ocean. But, you know, Earth systems don't actually stay within those categories. They all interact intensely in a whole load of extremely complex ways. So the Earth system is a kind of complex system of complex systems that if one tips, it can trigger a cascade of tipping across those other systems. They can go down effectively like dominoes, and that's what's happened, as far as we can tell, in previous mass extinction events like the Permian-Triassic boundary 251 million years ago, which seems to have been triggered by massive outpourings of carbon dioxide from the Siberian traps. And then that caused a whole series of cascading effects, which together amounted to systemic environmental collapse. Now, we could see this happening, I mean, starting at almost any point in Earth systems. So, for instance, if you look at the Amazon rainforest, which is coming under multiple assaults from deforestation and followed by cattle ranching and the rest, fires, from, of course, a great drying caused by global heating. The Amazon is responsible for creating what are called rivers in the sky, great streams of wet air traveling around the tropics and helping to drive the global circulation system. The Amazon is itself, the rainforest, is a complex system, and it has tipping points. As always with these systems, we don't know exactly where those points might lie, but there has to be a certain point beyond which deforestation then creates spontaneous collapse, because it generates its own weather. The trees, through evapotranspiration, create the clouds, which create the rain, which allow the trees to grow, which create the clouds, which create the rain. And if you remove enough of those trees, if you cut the hydrological cycle like that, then the whole lot could spontaneously collapse. And the implications of that would travel around the world. Now, part of the global circulation system to which the Amazon rainforests contribute is the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great loop of currents going around the whole Atlantic oceans and paralleled by currents in the air, a very complex system in its own right. And it's one leg of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, AMOC. One leg of this, the Gulf Stream, which ensures the UK does not have a climate like Siberia's. Now, the AMOC has two equilibrium states, broadly speaking, on and off. And it's currently in the on state, and everything you know and love, all your hopes and fears and your loves and your hates and your dreams and your nightmares depend on AMOC remaining in the on state. Nothing, if that goes off, basically nothing else matters. Nothing that you're concerned about, nothing you're interested in has any further relevance to your life because it's gone. AMOC flipped into the off state about 12,000 years ago due to a great flux of fresh water into the North Atlantic, which, because of the different floating and sinking properties of fresh water and salt water, basically switched that current off. And we were thrown into an event called the Younger Dryas for about 1,000 years, which basically pushed us back into Ice Age conditions and had ramifications all over the world. Basically, if heat is not being transferred from the tropics get hotter, the high latitudes get colder. It's, they're simple outputs from this complex system. AMOC is beginning to look very wobbly. Once more, it's weakened by about 15%. It was considered to be stable some time back. It's looking less certain now. But again, we have no idea where the tipping points might lie. But these signals, this flickering, these are the Mayday signals that our global complex systems are sending us. And you would have thought that any species being possessed of a survival instinct, understanding that these complex systems are sending this Mayday signal, would wish to act quickly and decisively, and in a way that is appropriate when engaging with complex systems. As we approach the 26th Climate Summit in Glasgow, starting in just a few days, we see governments doing anything but decisive action, or even appropriate action, or even action matched even roughly to the predicament that we face. So what governments propose, and I say propose because most of them aren't actually doing it, including, I'm sorry to say, our own, what they propose is gradual linear change towards a distant date. In our case, 2050. It's talking of net zero by 2050. It's nowhere on track to do that, our government, but that's what it says it's trying to do. Gradual linear change in order to prevent a complex system from passing its tipping point. But complex systems don't respond in gradual and linear ways. Gradual and linear change would be fine if we were dealing with a simple system, like a wash basin, where you gradually turn down the tap until the outflow through the plug hole is lower than the inflow through the tap and the water level drops. It makes a lot of sense. You could just turn down the tap. It would work in a complicated system, like a car, where you gradually take your foot off the accelerator and the car slows down. But there's no obvious connection between gradual, linear, incremental change in the stress levels which we're applying and the response of a complex system, which does not behave itself in gradual, linear, and incremental ways. especially when that complex system or system of systems could be coming close to its tipping points. The only appropriate response is sudden and drastic change. Suddenly and drastically stopping the levels of stress that we're applying to that system, which could tip it past that point. So I guess the central question of my talk this evening is, why aren't we all out on the streets demanding that sudden and drastic change? I mean, it's not impossible. It's not that we've never done sudden and drastic change before. Look at what happened when the US joined the Second World War on the 8th of December 1941, the day after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress, requested a declaration of war, and got it on the 8th of December. And within an extraordinarily short period, the whole economy and the whole of society were transformed by determined and decisive action. He radically reorganized government and radically reorganized society. To give you just a hint of this, between 1942 and 1945, the US government spent, in current dollar terms, more money than it spent between 1789 and 1941. I mean, isn't that extraordinary? You know, they tell us, oh, there's no money, we can't do it. It found more money in those 4 years, 42, 43, 44, 45, than it had found in current terms between 1789 and 1941. And it's just the most extraordinary thing. And then, you know, it raised the military budget 42-fold. It banned car production at the beginning of 1942. There were no cars manufactured until 1945. Men went in with jackhammers, hammered the massive equipment out of the foundations of the car factories within weeks. They had new assembly lines in those factories, completely new machines, turning out fighter planes, turning out artillery pieces, turning out amphibious landing craft, turning out munitions on a monumental scale. I mean, soon it was producing more of all of those things than Germany, Japan, Italy, and the UK put together. And we all know that when the US joined the Second World War, with that decisive force, everything changed. It's entirely plausible. And it changed the whole of society as well. You know, everyone had to behave in radically different ways from then on, and people were prepared to do that. So sudden and drastic change is entirely possible. You know, and this was before the digital era, which has made everything faster and everything easier, theoretically. So why aren't we demanding it? Well, I think there's two fundamental reasons. The first is that the public understanding of our climate and ecological and general environmental / Earth systems crisis is perhaps the biggest failure of public information in human history. If you buttonholed someone in the street and asked them even the most basic questions, like name more than one greenhouse gas, for example, or what is the current level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? I mean, the most basic questions about the most fundamental issue that we face, the existential crisis we face, the greatest catastrophe humankind has ever confronted. Questions as fundamental as who is the German Führer in 1941. Questions as fundamental as name more than one Allied power in 1941. That's how fundamental these questions are. The majority of people would not be able to answer them. And I'm talking here to a highly educated audience. Hands on heart, put your hand up if you can name more than one greenhouse gas. Yep, most, but not all. Hand on heart, put your hand up if you know what the current concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is, to within a few parts per million. Very small portion of the audience. I mean, I'm not blaming you for this. This is a systemic issue in its own right. And I have to say that my industry, the media, is very largely responsible for it. It has deliberately kept people in a state of ignorance about the greatest crisis that we've ever faced. But there's something more going on here. It's not just ignorance, or if it is ignorance, there's willful ignorance at play, willful blindness at play. Because it's become very clear to me that we go out of our way not to know and not to act on the little that we do know. In fact, often people seem to be acting in the most perverse way possible. It's like, let's swap our ordinary car for an SUV. Let's tick off that bucket list and go on 100 holidays of a lifetime. It's almost as if people are saying, well, if it was so serious, someone would stop me. It's as if they're challenging governments to say that it's serious. And the response is, well, no one's stopping me, so it can't be that serious. And if we engage with it at all, we do so in the most pathetic ways. We become obsessed by plastic bags and cotton buds and coffee cups, as opposed to looking at the systemic forces, the corporate power, the oligarchic power, the economic and political forces which are driving us towards catastrophe. We focus on what I call micro-consumerist bollocks instead of on the system. I'm not allowed to say that on the BBC, apparently. And so why is this? Why do we turn away? Why aren't we facing up to this? Why do we go so readily and quickly into denial? Why do we focus instead on the most mind-numbing trivia? I've done an exercise recently, and I urge you to do it next time there's a day of real climate disaster, when things, when there are huge fires, huge heat domes, huge droughts, huge floods, whatever it might be. Flick between the radio channels. Doesn't matter which ones, just flick between them and see what people are talking about. So the last time I tried this, I encountered a long conversation about whether you should be sitting down or standing up while pulling on your socks. I encountered another one about charcuterie boards for dogs, and many other similarly momentous discussions. And then I turned to the news channels and thought, well, this has got to be central to the news channels. But no, it was all the same, basically court gossip, which passes for political coverage. Who's in, who's out, who said what to whom. Skating constantly over the surface, stuck in the surface film, and not looking below, not looking at these existential crises that we face. In fact, there was a study recently came out by the media group Albert, who had analysed the subtitles from the entire output of UK TV to see what the TV stations were talking about. And they discovered that cake was mentioned 10 times as often as climate change. In fact, banana bread was mentioned more often than wind power and solar power put together. Scotch eggs were mentioned more often than biodiversity. Now, I'm not saying the media is society. I'm in a good position not to confuse the two different things. But this is what people watch. This is what they tune into. Where is the massive public demand for the seriousness, the moral seriousness that we should be demanding, that we depend on now for our survival? Where is this? Where are the millions on the streets? Yes, there are thousands on the streets from time to time, brilliant movements, mostly led by young people, with Fridays for Future, with the Sunrise Movement, Green New Deal Rising, Extinction Rebellion, and the rest of it. Fantastic, amazing movements, some of which I'm proud to belong to. But we're tiny in number by comparison to the size of the population, and we tend to be drawn from just particular corners. Where is everyone? This is a question I keep asking. Where is everyone? I mean, wake up. We are facing the greatest catastrophe ever, an existential crisis which could wipe us off the surface of the earth, together with most of the life forms with which we share this wonderful planet. And here we are, worrying about whether you should sit up or sit down or stand up while pulling on your socks. Now, I'm not saying that this is a conscious decision. I'm not saying that people on the radio are thinking, quick, let's talk about charcuterie boards for dogs. It's a subconscious reflex which tells us far more about ourselves than our conscious decisions do. And what is this reflex? What is it that's telling us not to pay attention, not to challenge the way governments are responding, not to challenge the systemic causes of these crises that we face? I don't know how many of you have read Vasily Grossman's magnificent novel, Life and Fate. Many readers in the room? One or two, thank you. I very strongly recommend it. It's a remarkable piece of work. And Vasily Grossman experienced some of the worst of Soviet totalitarianism, was constantly threatened as a Jewish man in the Soviet Union by Nazi invasion, and then, of course, by the anti-Semitism within the Soviet Union itself. And he had deep experience of the systems about which he wrote. And he concluded that there is a fundamental human trait that was discovered by these totalitarian systems and that was never suspected to be so powerful before, but having been discovered, was very effectively exploited. And this trait was obedience. He concluded that our instinct for obedience is stronger than our instinct for survival. Not just when the threat is a distant and chronic threat, even when it is an acute and visible threat. And he talked of people queuing, sometimes all day and all night, to be executed and maintaining their place in the queue. And he was at pains to say this isn't in any way to blame the victims for these great crimes, but that somehow people would just line up before a blood-filled ditch and wait to be shot. Primo Levi, in his book, If This Is a Man, came to a similar conclusion. At one point he says that some people handed themselves into the authorities in order to be in conformity with the law, and so doing basically condemned themselves, allowed themselves to be condemned to death. Again, not in any way blaming the victims for the terrible things that the criminals did in those totalitarian systems. But there's something about the human brain which lets us down. It's a kink in the human brain, this instinct to obey. And what we're doing when we focus on this trivia, what we're doing when we look anywhere except at our great crisis, what we're doing when we buy that SUV, what we're doing when we take that long-haul flight, what we're doing when we don't raise that uncomfortable subject of the person at the dinner party about to fly off to Thailand. In fact, we say, oh, wonderful, oh, have a great holiday, what a wonderful thing. Or we congratulate them on the holiday that they've just taken. What we're doing when we don't confront the structural forces, the corporations, the oligarchs, the plutocracy, which is driving us towards disaster, is obeying. We are obeying. We're obeying the social signals, we're obeying the political signals. We would rather face planetary collapse than the social embarrassment of raising these awkward subjects. We would rather face planetary collapse than the political trouble of going out on the street and the problems that that might cause in the workplace or at home or with the police, whatever it might be. Obedience is the great human flaw, and we do it in small ways and we do it in big ways. And part of this obedience is not looking below the surface, is obediently keeping our eyes on the little stuff that surrounds us and not seeing what lies underneath that little stuff. So what would we see if we look below? Well, the first thing I'd see is something that should terrify us out of our wits. Something which in the mainstream economic narrative can only be good. But when you look at it from an environmental point of view, it's absolutely horrifying. And this is economic growth. Economic growth, the great objective of all the world's governments. At the moment, with current levels of economic activity, Earth systems are being strained, possibly to breaking point. World Bank, IMF, OECD, they're not being overambitious. They just want a nice, steady 3% growth a year. 3% growth a year means that economic activity doubles every 24 years. So by 2045, all this economic activity is doubled. By 2069, it's doubled again, and then again, and then again, every 24 years. And with that, most of the environmental pressure doubles. Some things have been decoupled to an extent from economic growth, but most of the resource use has not been decoupled. Some of the climate impacts have been decoupled, a lot of them have not been decoupled. Basically, the more growth, the harder everything becomes, and the more likely it is that we push these fragile systems past their tipping points. Economic growth is like the Gemini Curse in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Now, I know that being academics, you might not all be entirely familiar with this, but Harry and his friends go into one of the vaults of Gringotts Bank to find this thing called a Horcrux, which is hidden in the treasure in this vault. But a curse has been put on this treasure, the Gemini Curse, which means that the treasure, if it's disturbed, starts doubling. It doubles, and then it doubles again, and it doubles again until it threatens to crush you to death. You are crushed to death under the weight of wealth in the Lestrange vault in Gringotts Bank. Economic growth is the Gemini Curse. This is the curse which the whole world lies under. It's treasure multiplying, and that multiplication of treasure drives us towards catastrophe. But economic growth is an outcome of something which lies a level below that. Something which, being obedient people, we scarcely dare name. It's like the name of God. At one point in pre-Christian theology, you could not mention God because it was blasphemous to do so. And the same in most parts of polite society applies to capitalism. That word we should not discuss. What is capitalism? Again, grab you on the street and say, what is capitalism? How many people would feel comfortable defining it here? Give a nice, neat summary of capitalism. A few, thank you. A few, not most. This highly selective and highly academic audience. And most people would, if forced, mumble something about buying and selling, hard work and enterprise. That's not what capitalism is about. Capitalism is a very peculiar and novel system. My most recent digging into it came about by a slightly weird route. I got obsessed with this brief passage in Jane Eyre, where St. John Rivers comes to Jane and tells her that Mr. Eyre of Madeira, her uncle, has unexpectedly bequeathed a great fortune on her. And it's okay because this fortune is in English funds. I think, English funds? I think, what are English funds? I mean, there was no such formal thing as English funds, but why? Why English funds? And I became slightly obsessed with this phrase. What is it? What was Charlotte Bronte trying to do when she said that Jane's fortune was in English funds? And then it struck me suddenly. Mr. Eyre of Madeira, a lot of very dodgy things happened on Madeira. And a lot of very dodgy things happened in Jamaica, where Mr. Rochester's money came from. And by putting this money into English funds, it seemed to me that Charlotte Bronte was saying, this is clean money. This is all right. It's got into English funds. It's fine. And she was distancing it from the money that Mr. Eyre had made in Madeira and Mr. Rochester had made in Jamaica. And so then I thought, okay, so what was going on in Madeira? And I started reading up the history of Madeira, and I was lucky enough very quickly to come across a remarkable paper by Jason Moore about the economic history of Madeira, which was first colonized by the Portuguese in 1420. And within a few decades, they did something which had never really been done, not in the same way, anywhere else on earth. And Moore makes a very compelling case that it was on Madeira that capitalism began. Because what they did was to create, in effect, a terra nullis, a place without people, a place without precedent, a place without a previous economy. And it just happened that Madeira was indeed, at that time, an uninhabited island, named, incidentally, for its Madeira, its wood in Portuguese. Madeira is wood in Portuguese, which was in great abundance. It also had very rich soils. So after a while, they realized they didn't have to play by the old rules. They could treat this as a blank slate. And what if we just bring in the different elements of this economy from different places? Sugarcane. They brought in sugarcane. Who's going to grow and process the sugarcane? Oh, they brought in slaves from Africa. Where's the money going to come from this? Oh, they brought in money from bankers in Genoa and Flanders. So they straight away fulfilled Karl Polanyi's 3 criteria for identifying capitalism, which is the commodification of land, labor, and money. And instantly produced this incredibly productive economy. By the 1470s, Madeira was the world's primary source of sugar. That's where most of the sugar was being exported from, this tiny island in the Atlantic. And there was an incredible productivity of labor because of these rich soils, these rich resources, and these slaves being driven to death by the slave owners. And the sugar production peaked in 1506. But within 20 years, it had fallen by 80%. And so had the productivity of labor, fallen by 80% in 20 years. And Moore says the main reason for this is that Madeira ran out of Madeira. Most of the accessible wood was exhausted, and the wood was fundamental to it because you needed, 40 kilos of wood to make 1 kilo of sugar, because you needed to cook the sugar cane to get the sugar out of it, and then you needed to cook the sugar to process it into a form that could then be exported. It needed a huge amount of wood. And the further they went down that line, the further and further they had to go to extract that wood up into the steep mountains and the rest of it, and it became harder and harder. And because it required far more labor, the labor productivity per kilo of sugar collapsed. And so, and at the same time, incidentally, several endemic species on Madeira became extinct because so much of the forest had been wiped out. So what did the Portuguese do? They moved to the next place, São Tomé. And the whole cycle was repeated. Boom, bust, quit. And then they moved to Brazil. Boom, bust, quit. Caribbean. Boom, bust, quit. And Moore points out that this cycle of very rapid exploitation, driven by the commodification of and the sort of loss of all prior meaning of land, labor, and money, and the extraction of extremely high labor productivity for short periods of time on the frontier, is not a bug in capitalism. It is a fundamental feature of capitalism. In fact, it is capitalism. That's what capitalism does, and that's what capitalism is. It is a fire front moving across the world, working through the world's resources, actual, virtual, human, natural, whatever they might be, burning through them, discarding the residue, and moving on. And even in the most physical terms, we see this fire front still expanding. We see it moving through the Amazon rainforest today. amongst some of the last unexploited places, moving through West Africa, moving through West Papua. The last unexploited places literally being burnt up in front of our eyes. But they're running out of new frontiers, even the physical frontiers, so they're going to the deep ocean to mine the minerals there. Jeff Bezos and others are talking of going into space to mine the minerals there. And the fire front, the many fire fronts which capitalism has lit, are now converging into a global fire front called systemic environmental collapse. It is not a bug, it is a feature. This is capitalism. Environmental destruction is a fundamental and intrinsic feature of this system that governs and constrains our lives, this system we scarcely dare discuss. But of course, capitalism itself is a means to an end, and the end is the extreme wealth of those who possess the greatest power within the system, the corporations and the oligarchs. And by oligarchs, I'm not just talking about Russians. There are oligarchs all over the world. And again, it's one of those things we tend not to talk about. But these are the people with enormous power over our lives, but also enormous environmental footprints. And there's a whole series of interesting papers showing it doesn't matter how green you think you are. Your environmental impacts are a function of your wealth. And you might tell yourself, well, I'm a green consumer because, look, I do my recycling. But you blind yourself to the other things that you might be doing. So, for instance, even a moderately wealthy person in this country is now quite likely to have a second home, which is about the most destructive thing that a moderately wealthy person can do, is to own a second home. Because if you have a second home, another house has to be built to accommodate the family that you've displaced. The massive environmental implications, and yet it's just what polite society does. You don't raise any questions over it at the dinner table, even though it destroys entire communities and makes people homeless. Oh, how lovely, oh, how charming, darling. Oh, what a lovely cottage. Oh, well, you must come and stay. I mean, honestly, it's free for most of the year. We only use it occasional weekends. So please, be our guest. Oh, thank you so much. Where's the disobedience? Where are the people standing? Sorry, you're destroying people's lives by owning this house. And in fact, you're contributing to the destruction of the biosphere. But we politely go along with it. I go along with it. I don't challenge my friends on it. I'm being obedient. And for God's sake, if I'm being obedient, we're really stuffed. And we're very good at this. We're very good at deceiving ourselves. And so, as a sort of large number of papers show, we con ourselves as to how green we are, and what the real driver of that is the amount of money we have. And we will consume more or less up to the limits that money allows. And so you have people like Bill Gates going, oh, well, I put biofuel in my private jets. And biofuel is itself one of the most destructive things going on around the world today, causing massive land take, massive deforestation, massive soil destruction in order to produce this stuff to make millionaires feel better about themselves. And the effects of great wealth, empowered by capitalism, delivered by capitalism, extend beyond the immediate impacts that the wealthy impose on the world's environmental systems, because they also contribute to this system of obedience. Why do we tolerate this system? Why do we accept a system which is destroying our life support systems while at the same time exploiting and immiserating so many people around the world, this system called capitalism? Because we're all temporarily embarrassed millionaires. The promise it makes is that that finger is going to be pointing at you soon. You're going to be the beneficiary. Well, if we did all become millionaires, as the system promises, we would cook the planet in minutes. It can't take that level of wealth. It just can't, because that wealth, what we call wealth, is actually poverty. It's the destruction of the only real wealth we've got, which is our natural wealth, which is our Earth systems. It just can't happen, but because We're lulled into this belief system, this belief that we will be the beneficiaries of the system through this incredibly powerful propaganda that capitalism generates. We obey. We allow ourselves to be driven towards the cliff by the very rich and very powerful people who basically run the world. And so we collaborate in our own destruction. We consent to something that no one in their right mind should ever consent to, because our obedience instinct is more powerful than our survival instinct. So our survival requires that we no longer consent. Our survival requires that we stand up to this earth-eating system. We demand, and we can discuss this in questions if you like, because there are some ideas floating about, entirely different systems which generate genuine human prosperity without creating this great pyramid scheme of capitalism whose apparent health today depends on the destruction of the health and life of future generations, which steals from the future just as it steals from the colonies. And I consider the colonies still to be exploited today by other means. It's a system of looting across time and across space. And we must no longer consent to this system. We must no longer obey this system. And throughout history, those who have changed political systems are those who refuse to obey. Whether it was the democracy campaigners in the early 19th century, whether it was the suffragettes in the early 20th century, whether it was the independence movements in India and many other nations, whether it was the civil rights movement in the United States, these were people who did not obey. And now we see powerful movements, far too small, far too few in number, but morally and intellectually powerful nonetheless, such as Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion and Green New Deal Rising and Sunrise Movement, coming up around the world, who understand the most important lesson from history, who understand the fundamental thing that should be in the front of all our minds. Survival requires disobedience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure there are a few questions. We've got time for a few questions.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much for coming and for that wonderful talk. I'm a graduate student here at Wolfson College, and I have 1 year left in the beautiful bubble of Oxford before I get churned out into the real world. And before coming here, I worked in conservation for 4 years. And the big decision that I'm trying to make moving forward is where that disobedience should lie. Because I've stood outside of the capitalist system and tried to change it from the outside in my previous job. But it also feels like being co-opted by the system to go inside it and try to change it, knowing that you'll very likely just become a member, kind of cog in the machine. But it also feels like to ignore it is basically allowing it to continue and hoping that you can change it from the outside. So I was just wondering if you could give some advice. I think there are probably some other graduate students in the room on what we should do with our careers and where disobedience should lie there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, the first advice I give to everyone is don't act alone. Whatever you do, don't be by yourself. The whole drive of the past 50 years has been to individuate us, to divide and rule, in effect, to say, you're not citizens, you're consumers. And if you want to act, consume differently. Well, we have very little power as consumers, but we have great power as citizens combining with each other to create political change. That's where our power lies. In fact, that's the only place where our power really lies. If you get sucked into the system, it's much bigger than you are. It will chew you up and spit you out. And I've seen so many people. I mean, when I was at university, I was surrounded by right-on people. And they were all going to go work for Oxfam or be artists or have small holdings or, had all these dreams. And then suddenly, the banks turn up with their glossy presentations and their stalls, and it was just one after another, sucked into the maw of that system. Hey, oh, wait a minute, how did that happen? And then you challenge them and you say, oh no, I'm going to reform it from within. And before very long, they've got a mortgage. Well, I've just got to pay off the mortgage, and then I'll reform it from within. And then they've got children. Well, I've just got to get them a decent education, private education. Then I'll reform it from within. And of course, they're lost, And then it's like, oh, that was just student nonsense. That was just a dream. We can't afford to get lost in that way. It's hard, it's really, really hard not to succumb to it, not to obey, not to get sucked into it. It's really, really difficult, especially with all these instruments of obedience like debt. Debt is a fantastic instrument used to make us obey. And they load students with debt, and postgraduate students with debt, because that makes us conform. It makes, we're terrified by it. It is terrifying. It's a horrendous thing. But somehow we have to find it in ourselves to resist. And these corporations, they're not just bigger than us. Collectively, they're cleverer than any one of us, because they have all these ways of flattering you and cajoling you and persuading you and pushing you and forcing you and bribing you and blackmailing you, subtle and clever and insidious ways, which make you feel, oh yeah, I am making a difference. Yeah, no, they are listening to my concerns. Yeah, no, this is all right, until suddenly it isn't anymore. And you come out the other side of it and you think, oh my God, they've just stolen 20 years of my life. It's gone. So I don't want to give you individual advice. I mean, my life is no model. But, just the general advice is resist.
Okay, I think we've got a question from online. We'll just...
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just a messenger, and this question is from a gentleman called Leonard, who asked, you suggest that capitalism is the problem, and if so, what is the solution? Is it socialism or communism? If you could comment on that.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks again for your question. So, I mean, I don't have all the answers, and other answers are available. I'm not claiming that I've got the complete system in mind, but there's the sort of at least partial half system which appeals most to my mind is what I call private sufficiency, public luxury. Now, the thinking behind it goes as follows. If we all seek private luxury, we will very quickly burn through planetary resources and push Earth systems past their tipping points. If we all try to live like the millionaires, as I said, we cook the planet very quickly indeed. There's not even enough physical space. If everyone tries to have their own swimming pool and their own tennis court and their own playground for their kids and all the rest of it, Oxford would cover half of England. England would cover all of Europe. Where would everyone else live? You can't do it. It's just not possible. And it's another myth of capitalism that we can all achieve private luxury. We just can't. There's not enough ecological space, there's not enough physical space for us to do it. And it's a deception because, the rich people, they can have their private luxury and con the rest of us into thinking that ours, well, one day, just wait, just be good citizens, be obedient, and one day that good fortune will come to you too. Well, it's not going to happen. But we can all have public luxury without bursting through planetary limits. We can have great public tennis courts and public swimming pools and public parks and community centres and playgrounds and art galleries and museums and transport systems and health systems and education systems and the rest of it, where we share resources, where me expanding my wings doesn't stop you from expanding your wings. Me enjoying roaming around on land when it's public land doesn't stop you from roaming around in it. I don't put up any no trespassing signs when I go to the park. And with far fewer resources, you can meet a far wider range of needs. But I'm not saying that extends into every aspect of our lives. We also need our private sufficiency, where we have our own modest home and our own modest few things within the home which are ours, and in our private domain, where no one else can intrude on that. That, I think, is also very important to people. But if we want to get bigger, if we want to expand, if we want to amplify our activities, we do it in the public domain. And that's where luxury should be. Now, I know this isn't really an ism, it's not a complete system, it's not a total alternative to capitalism, but in conjunction with many of the other ideas which are floating around, well, I think it's part of the picture, and it's a part which I happen to be most interested in my amateur and blundering way.
Okay, we have to be a little bit mindful of time, so 2 more questions. I see one here, and then we go up there.
Thank you. Obviously, you've kind of highlighted the systemic failings of capitalism, the profit motive, for example, the whole kind of green basing, here's cardboard straws, and now you're green. I mean, the whole profit maximization system is inherently intent on keeping it the way it is. My question is really, do you think the green movement as it is too factional, in that you've got, elements like, for example, promoting veganism, and then suddenly they're against those promoting active transport, that type of thing? Do you think in this kind of world we've got, in terms of the movements we've got, have they lost sight of the kind of systemic problem that needs to be challenged? And what do you think is the best way to rectify that?
Yeah, factionalism is definitely a problem, but it's all the fault of those bastards. Look, we aren't very good at coming together around ideas. I mean, we're good at coming together around particular actions for one day or even a few days, but mobilizing around a set of ideas, I don't know, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing that we're not very good at that? The diversity is a good thing, and we know that diverse, complex systems, weakly linked, can be more resilient than strongly linked, homogeneous systems with big nodes and the rest of it. So if we see our movements as a complex system, maybe there's strength in the fact that we're not all singing from the same hymn sheet. But we obviously do need to unify around certain political demands. And I think we are pretty unified around certain political demands. I mean, everyone I know who's active in green movements totally recognizes that net zero by 2050 is nowhere near enough. It's not fast enough, it's not big enough, it just doesn't even touch it. And we want much more rapid and decisive action from governments. Now, there might be divisions about exactly what that looks like, exactly how it can be achieved, but actually the fundamentals are there and they're quite unifying. And in fact, by comparison to, say, the Labour movement, the Green movement is pretty harmonious. Movements are always going to have a degree of factionalization, but it's nothing like the factionalization that we've seen all too often on the left, unfortunately. And so I'm fairly optimistic about these movements in terms of their quality. What we need to see is the quantity. We just need more people involved. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be out on the street, sitting on the street or something, not at all. An effective protest movement is an ecosystem. We need loads of different people fulfilling different roles. You need the people on the phone, you need the techie people who know how to use computers, you need the accountants, you need the lawyers, you need people with a whole range of skill sets to make an effective movement, all coming together with one general aim. And the general aim, is very clear and widely accepted. And we are seeing people with skill sets, but lots of different ones. But we need just far more. We need to make it much, much bigger. And there are great movements to join, so please join them.
Hi, my question was about something you said at the beginning of the talk, where you said that you think that the media is the willful perpetuator of public misinformation. What would you like to see the media doing, like very specifically, maybe like your own paper? What do you think the Guardian should be doing differently than what they're doing right now?
Thank you. Well, I'm going to avoid talking specifically about The Guardian because it's a bit close to home. Though generally, I think, things are looking pretty good in terms of the coverage coming up to the Glasgow summit and stuff. But, if we look at the media as a whole, this is failure on a massive level. And can it be changed? Well, the billionaire press, no, it can't be changed because it's a billionaire press. Isn't it amazing that, we don't even have a good commonly accepted term for these people? We say the tabloids. Well, most of them aren't tabloid, and it doesn't matter if they're tabloid or broadsheet. It depends on the politics, but actually it depends on the ownership. So it's the papers owned by extremely rich people, mostly men, are, that's the defining characteristic. So I call it the billionaire press. And they are structurally committed to a system which is destroying Earth systems. They're structurally committed to capitalism, they're structurally committed to plutocracy, they're structurally committed to oligarchy, because they are owned by billionaires. So we can't expect any consistent good to come out of them. There might be the occasional article, the occasional feature, yeah, fine, but the overall impact is going to be to slow, to frustrate, to confuse any attempts to address these systemic crises that we face. So we need alternatives. We need to find other ways of connecting and communicating, because trying to do it through that deeply flawed, structurally flawed system is just not going to work. Now, the public service broadcasters, the BBC in particular, their failings have been in some ways just as great. And I know this from bitter experience. I spent 30 years banging my head against a brick wall with the BBC, trying to get them to cover these issues. And at last, having been extremely hostile, actively hostile to environmental issues, with the channel controllers literally cussing people out when they brought them in environmental proposals, just saying, what the F are you doing, bringing me this effing rubbish, you can F right off, literally saying that. It's just outrageous. Abuse, abusive, controlling, imperial behavior by these channel controllers who just completely shut down environmental coverage. And now they're doing the sort of coverage that they should have done 20 years ago on the BBC. They're not giving us the coverage that we need today, which is looking at systemic failure, looking at the system change which is required to avert the collapse of Earth systems. It's failure all the way through. And you would hope that the BBC, would not be subject to the same constraints as the billionaire press is, but unfortunately, it's obedient. It obeys its master's voice. It's ultimately controlled by government, and it does what it's told. It doesn't want to make programs which are going to upset the rest of the media. It does what it's told. And all down the line, and I know this because I worked for a couple of years at the BBC, people obey. They do what they're told. And the command gets passed down the system, and whether it's a good command or a bad command, it gets obeyed. And what we see, the fundamental problem throughout the media, is a fundamental problem from which we all suffer. It's the problem of obedience.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the talk. So let's thank Mr. Monbiot. And before we close, I would like to use that little opportunity and plug. On 25th of November, we'll have the annual Sarfraz lecture. Professor Adil Najam will present on climate change, or Age of Adaptation, climate change with a view from Pakistan. The details are on the Wolfson homepage. It's in the same realm of planetary emergency. And thank you very much, Mr. Monbiot. Thank you very much for being here and for tuning in. And I hope you have a good evening, good day, and a safe trip home. Thank you.
Thank you.